Alright, so in this installment of the video, we're still continuing our discussion of Cold War and post-war America. We're going to be talking about two things that dramatically changed American life during the post-war period. And that's the atomic age, basically the fear of nuclear war, and the television age, the emergence of the television as a cultural staple. So first, we're going to talk about the growing power and military reliance on nuclear weapons and the anxiety that creates in America. Also, we're going to talk about what the hydrogen bomb, when and how it was developed. We'll talk about the arms race and its effects on the U.S. And finally, how Americans reacted to that. Alright, so the hydrogen bomb was in effect a more powerful atom bomb. Whereas atom bombs got their power from splitting atoms, the hydrogen bomb gets its power from fusing atoms together, and it creates basically the process that stars use to power themselves. So the sun, it's basically the power of the sun. And fusion bombs, hydrogen bombs are much more powerful than the atomic bombs, which were more powerful than any weapon ever used before. So the hydrogen bomb was developed during the late 40s and early 50s, and the first hydrogen bomb was detonated by the United States on the Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands in November 1952. It created a 3-mile fireball and released 10 megatons of energy. The testing of the hydrogen bomb was a shock to nations throughout the world, and the Soviets very quickly began trying to develop their own. And they do finally in 1953, a year later, almost a year later, test their first H-bomb. So this creates an arms race, this contest between the U.S. and the Soviet Union to see who's going to be able to build the more powerful weapons, build the biggest arsenal. Basically, each side is one-upping the other, trying to gain an advantage. And this also resulted in new military strategies developed. Both of the countries start to depend less on conventional things like, number of soldiers, ships, tanks, rifles, bombs, airplanes, things of that, and start to rely more on nuclear weapons and basically trying to frighten the other guys into doing what they want them to do. So the idea of massive retaliation, mutually assured destruction that we talked about before. But in order to do that, you have to have more bombs than the other guy. So this promotes a lot of research and development of new bombs, and not just as it develops bombs, but it develops other technologies that we'll see down the road. So scientists work to make bombs smaller, more easily delivered. You have aircraft were originally the preferred means of carrying these bombs. So you had huge bomber airplanes, like B-52s and B-2s and things of that nature. But by the end of the 50s, both countries are developing what are called intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, basically rockets that can deliver nuclear warheads and on a target. Some new technologies that we see: nuclear power is very quickly harnessed for energy. You start having nuclear-powered submarines. So this is going to be a huge leap. Ships begin to be powered by nuclear power, and not long after, in the late 50s, nuclear power plants are going to be built throughout the United States to provide electricity. The good thing about nuclear power is it's basically infinite. It can continue and continue. You don't have to use much resources. You do need uranium, but once you've enriched that uranium, you can use it over and over and over again. The problem, of course, is what to do with the waste, and that's always been the problem with nuclear power: is what to do with the waste, and what happens if the plant fails and then you have nuclear fallout. Anyway. So the Soviets built new and improved weapons and delivery systems, and then they launched the first artificial satellite into space. And this was named Sputnik. And Sputnik really caused a panic in America. Americans began to believe that the Soviets had passed us in scientific skill and knowledge. So this begins what becomes known as the space race, and it leads to the creation of NASA, National Aeronautics Space Administration. So July in 1958, they launched. The United States launches its own satellite, and in July '58, we create NASA. Americans, of course, were constantly worried about nuclear war. After Pearl Harbor, it kind of shattered this idea of American invincibility and safety from the rest of the world. So, and we'd also seen the power of the atom bomb with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and nuclear weapons could kill entire cities. The hydrogen bombs were even more powerful. People also feared streams of radioactive particles that were produced by nuclear explosions. So even if the blast didn't kill you, you were worried about, the radioactivity that caused burns, cancers, birth defects, and sometimes death. Oftentimes death. Many people in Japan, for instance, died of radiation poisoning, not from the initial blast. Anyway, during the testing of an H-bomb in the Marshall Islands, you had bad weather spreading the nuclear fallout. One sailor actually died during the testing, and many had to leave their homes permanently. And the island on which the H-bomb was tested was forever pretty much destroyed. So Americans react in a number of ways. Once they formed, for one, we formed the Civil Defense, the Federal Civil Defense Association, which educated people, prepared the public for nuclear emergencies. Also issued books and films, for example, like Duck and Cover, which we saw in class. Great video. If you looking back on it now, it seems kind of silly, but it was very serious at the time. Operation Alert tested the readiness of cities, and Americans individually built bomb shelters and pressured the government to limit the development of these weapons. So you had the development of the Test Ban Treaty, and you see, as we saw as we're going to see in the Twilight Zone movie or show that we're going to watch. It really affected movies and TV and music. Everything had plots centered on radiation and nuclear attack and all that kind of stuff. Eisenhower, even though he had done a lot to build up the power of the military-industrial complex, when he's leaving office, he uses that as an opportunity to talk about, say, look, we need to limit the power of the military and industry that builds those weapons. He warns that power could be used to negatively influence the government. And, that's going to become largely true. All right, so the Cold War influenced American culture, and that's really going to show in some of the TV shows and movies that come out at the time. So we're going to talk about television right now, and it becomes a major force in American culture in the 1950s and moving forward. So we're going to talk about how the TV changed America in the 1950s, what were some of the other technological developments that occurred, and how American culture changed during that time period. All right, so World War II saw a lot of change, and by the end of World War II, you had television basically had started getting ready for home use. So in post-war period, consumers purchased TVs. 1950, 9% of U.S. households have a television. By 10 years later, almost 90%. So 10 times more people have TVs. So it has an immediate impact on American culture. Politics obviously is going to change as a result, and of course advertising, the way products are advertised, is going to change. And many people have questioned the effects of television. This started almost immediately, especially on children. But it does change American life. But politicians are going to realize the power that TV has, similar to the radio before it. You had Nixon with his checker speech, Joseph McCarthy using using television audiences to make his arguments, and then advertisers, of course, obviously latch right onto it. And you'll have single advertisers sponsoring programs like you did on the radio. But as producing TV shows gets more expensive, you're going to have more and more people sponsoring shows, and this is where we get what we call commercials. Programming was a lot of comedy, a lot of variety shows. You had Lucille Ball and I Love Lucy. Milton Berle had a variety show that had comedy and music. American Bandstand was appealed to young people. They had lots of rock and roll acts and things of that nature. Soap operas start to come on, things like Days of Our Lives and One Life to Live and that kind of stuff. Crime dramas like Dragnet, so the cop show that we all know today. And of course, many were concerned about the effects of TV. Congress actually had hearings looking into the effects of violent content on young viewers. And, you had some game show, a scandal about a game show that had been rigged. That was a huge scandal in the 1950s. Of course, most of the violence that we're talking about is tamed by today's standards. Other technologies that come out are the development of transistor for electronics. So it works like a vacuum tube, but early computers, like vacuum tubes and early computers, but there's advantages. They're smaller than the vacuum tubes, and other electronics use them, and it makes electronics smaller. Radios, computers, televisions, all these things that used to take up a lot of space become smaller and smaller. And it's in 51 that you have the creation of the first computer by UNIVAC. And it was so big it weighed like 30,000 pounds. So that's 15 tons for a computer. And here we are, decades later, and we have computers that fit, literally in the palm of our hand. You also had the computer chip invented toward the end of the 1950s. Again, going to allow computers to get much smaller. One of the biggest developments of the time frame was the polio vaccine that was invented by Jonas Salk. Polio was very contagious. It had really terrorized American families for a long time. It was one of the biggest fears of parents that their children could contract polio because the way that the virus spread, children were more likely to get contracted. Of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt contracted polio as an adult, but he was just one of millions who were impacted by polio. And the polio vaccine is a huge relief for the American people, and it winds up within a decade pretty much eradicating polio. Now, economically, the 1950s were a great time for America. The economy grew a great deal. You had the baby boom during the 1950s as all these people came back from the war and got good jobs or were making more money, and they had more children. Of course, the baby boom has put pressure on our current system, obviously, for Social Security and Medicare and things of that nature. But that boom begins in the post-war period. And this also creates a search for bigger houses, so you have the development of the suburb, and then when they buy these houses, they're filling them with all new appliances. Everything was all about the most modern things: stoves, refrigerators, vacuums, any kind of gadget. I mean, 1950s were a gadget crazy time, and this is because there was high employment, very low unemployment, and pretty high wages. Now, there were Americans that were criticizing this new consumerism. They called, Kenneth Galbraith, for instance, called America the affluent society and said we were too focused on wealth and money. Michael Harrington talked about, how the nation's poor had largely been forgotten. And other commentaries like William White said, where's our individuality? We're all living in the same house. We're all driving the same car. We're wearing the same clothes. So there were some critics. And like I said, the suburbs were growing. Levittown was the first new suburb. It was built by a gentleman by the name of Levitt outside of New York City and became a very popular place to live for people of that time. Also, the population begins to shift towards the Sun Belt in the south and the western parts of the nation. You also had the development of the interstate highway system, which creates a whole new industries and really reinforces the love of the American car. And finally, you start to have some pushback, artistic pushback against this this kind of sameness that everybody seems to have. And some of your most famous movie stars are kind of those rebels. James Dean, Marlon Brando. They play roles that are kind of rebellious and anti-establishment. There goes the bell on this snow day. And, writers like the Beat Generation, Jack Kerouac kind of took the position as outsiders and talked about, pushing back against the mainstream. And, of course, rock and roll was all about individuality and pushing boundaries, and that's going to kind of set the stage for the 1960s. So the 50s, while we see them as a kind of a calm time, they're also a time of a lot of upheaval and change. So that's what lead us right into the 1960s in our next unit. We'll talk to you guys later. See ya.